This conflict is complicated. So it's really important that we kind of spell out who the players are. And we're going to do that. But the war that broke out in April 2023 was a real blow to people because just 5 years earlier, in 2018, ordinary Sudanese people were beginning to have hope that fundamental transformative change was possible in the country. We know that millions of Sudanese people took part in a nationwide mass movement determined to end the authoritarian regime of Omar al-Bashir, a dictator who had ruled over the country, as you mentioned, for some 30 years. So help us to understand what has happened or what happened in Sudan between 2018 and 2023. Can you kind of take us back to those hopeful times of 2018 and then also just kind of explain who the players are?
So as you mentioned, the revolution that kind of erupted in December of 2018 was particularly significant because it started in Sudan's kind of rural and sort of peripheral areas before it arrived in Khartoum in February of 2019 and sort of centralized in a massive sit-in in front of the military headquarters in the capital, and then, of course, ousted al-Bashir in April of 2019. And it was very powerful because we'd had several revolutions before, one in 1964, one in 1985 that had overthrown military dictatorships, but none this broad, if you will, and none that had brought together rural demands for land reform with long-standing grievances from areas that had been impacted by state violence really since independence, with sort of more urban demands for economic justice. The resistance committees that we talked about earlier, they predate the revolution. A lot of them, you sort of think about their roots as having emerged from protests that happened in 2011, in 2013, and in 2016, primarily against IMF-recommended austerity measures.
The International Monetary Fund.
Yes, exactly. And that's actually one of the ways that the revolution started, is that it was a response to austerity measures that al-Bashir's regime had implemented. So you had this mobilization happening, in June of 2019. It was a microcosm of what people hoped Sudan could be, beyond military rule, beyond elite rule. Sudan has, for most of its history, been under military rule. And people, certainly the young people who were, mobilizing with these resistance committees, had never experienced anything beyond the Bashir regime. And so it was a really powerful mobilization. And in June of 2019, the state, and it was actually led by the RSF, committed a massacre in the sit-in, killing several hundred people, breaking it up. And then, a couple of months after, they formed a transitional government that was a power-sharing agreement between military elites from within al-Bashir's inner circle. Al-Burhan, head of the army, and Hemeti, head of the Rapid Support Forces, were kind of part of the military wing of that power-sharing agreement. And then there were a group of sort of hand-picked technocrats and civilian elites, I would say, who were part of the mobilization against the Bashir regime, who formed the civilian part of that transitional government. But it was during that time, really, that the resistance committees and the more grassroots elements of the revolution were sidelined when that transitional government was formed. And I think that was the beginnings, really, of the counter-revolution, because the civilian elites turned outwards, implementing more neoliberal reforms and, for example, normalizing relations with Israel in exchange for annual funding from the World Bank, $1 billion in annual funding, and other kinds of policies that really deepened Sudan's economic crisis and made life harder rather than better for people.
Help us to understand why the popular revolution, in addition to, obviously, these austerity measures that were being implemented by the Bashir regime, what were they revolting against? What did the al-Bashir regime represent? Who was he?
Part of what was perhaps powerful but also challenging in unifying people around a central set of demands is that people had a different relationship to the state. If you were from Darfur, for example, and from a non-Arab community, you would have experienced the genocide in Darfur that started in 2003, that at the time was led by the Janjaweed, who were later turned into the Rapid Support Forces. And they were essentially a paramilitary group that was armed, and they're mostly pastoralists who identify as Arabs, against sedentary non-Arab communities who were competing with each other for grazing land as the kind of climate crisis was expanding. Of course, people who had been displaced or had lost relatives due to the genocide in 2003 had a particular relationship to the Bashir regime, whereas somebody in Khartoum, maybe who's from a more middle-class background, who isn't as impacted by state violence, might have a sort of a grievance that is more around the austerity measures and the kind of economic crisis and how difficult it is to make ends meet. And then if you go to the Jazeera, the rural parts of Sudan, where, the vast majority of Sudanese, 60 to 70%, still rely on agriculture partially to make a living. And the Bashir regime implemented privatization policies that really decimated the agricultural sector and made it a lot harder for small farmers and pastoralists to survive. And in fact, the rapid support forces draw mostly, in terms of their recruitment, from pastoralists who have been impacted by those privatization policies and by the influx of both domestic and foreign investments in agriculture and kind of large-scale agribusiness projects that cut off grazing routes and dispossess people of their land. And so I think there are various reasons that people protested against al-Bashir. But one of the things I wanted to briefly mention is that the Janjaweed, which turned into the RSF around 2013, they were sort of formalized by the Bashir regime as a coup-proofing strategy against the military.
So the Janjaweed that became the RSF, this was a creation of Omar al-Bashir, who was trying to put down rebel forces in the Darfur region who felt as if they had been marginalized, who felt as if they had never been given their due by the state. Is that a kind of a way of kind of understanding the reason for the rebellions in Darfur?
Yes. And I think the rebellions in Darfur at their roots go back to the 1950s when the Sudanese state was forming. The British left 800 seats kind of were handed over to Sudanese elites, essentially. But those elites were from the north and center of the country.
Who are Arab? Is that a way of understanding it?
Yes, they identify as Arab, but also Nubian, but they're central and northern Sudanese. There's definitely a racialized element, but I would say that it was the state itself that became a kind of ethno-nationalist, racialized state, in the sense that, and Amir Idris, a historian from Darfur, describes this very well in his work, where he talks about the ways that we saw from the very formation of the Sudanese government a kind of forced Arabization and Islamization project imposed on an incredibly diverse country. And as a result, you saw through the formation of this government or state structure, an elite state form to the exclusion and at the expense of peripheral regions like South Sudan, which at the time were, there were 2 million people, the size of Texas, and Darfur, which is also the size of Texas and home to millions.
And these regions, Nisrin, these regions are resource rich. These regions have oil. These regions have plentiful arable land. So these are regions were very valuable to the state.
Yes, exactly. And so by essentially making sure that those regions don't have adequate representation in governments, right? That means that allocation for infrastructure development, et cetera, becomes centralized in certain regions at the expense of others. And people, of course, resisted against that. And instead of the government listening and elites listening to that, those complaints for decades fell on deaf ears. So what we saw happening in 2003 when Darfurian resistance fighters started to take up arms was decades of having been neglected and marginalized and
impoverished, immiserated.
Yes. There was a famine in the 1980s, for example. At the time, President Numeri not only ignored the famine, refused to bring food aid in to Darfur, and hundreds and thousands of people died, right? So there's a long history, a very complex but also violent history in relationship to the state in places like Darfur and South Sudan as well. The South Sudanese resistance fighters took up arms in 1955, right before we gained independence, for very similar reasons to why Darfurians took up arms in 2003. The roots are the same. It's the Sudanese state being sort of captured by elites, exploiting resources from these vast, I don't even like to call them peripheries because they're very large areas. But as you said, 75% of Sudan's oil resources are now in independent South Sudan, right? Darfur is not only rich in sort of agricultural land, but also in all kinds of minerals like gold, like uranium, that are currently fueling this war. And so we saw consecutive regimes, not only the Bashir regime, but also the Nimeri regime, really violently repress resistance and displace people off of their land and their livelihoods in order to enable the continued resource extraction and enrichment of elites in government, which also gradually took over more and more of the economy, to the point where when the revolution started, the military owned over 200 companies in rubber, oil, infrastructure, real estate, and essentially about 70% of the economy was run by military elites, right? Which is partly why Sudanese people have for decades not really been able to benefit from the kind of resources and the richness that exists in Sudan, because it's been essentially stolen by the elites.
So the two forces that are at war right now, the Rapid Support Forces and also the Sudanese Armed Forces, they're both businesses. Like Burhan, who heads the Sudanese Armed Forces, and Hemeti, who heads the RSF, they're both major players in Sudan's economy.
Yes, absolutely. There's some overlapping economic interests and some separate, but the RSF, after it was formalized, right, in 2013, the European Union, through something called the Khartoum process in 2014, essentially turned them into their border patrol by externalizing their border regime to the border between Libya and Sudan. And so there was an infusion of about $200 million that then allowed the RSF to expand and formalize them, legitimize them as border control. They then were also used as kind of mercenaries in the war against Yemen, right, by the Saudi coalition.
And the UAE as well.
Yes, exactly, by the UAE and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
So there's been a long-standing relationship between the UAE and the RSF, which is partly why that partnership where the UAE is now extracting Sudanese gold in exchange for weapons to the RSF is not necessarily like a very new thing. It's kind of dates back to that kind of them using the RSF as mercenaries for hire.
You've been listening to a clip of In Bed with the Elephant with me, your host, Adrian Harewood. Be sure to check out the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, iHeartRadio, and YouTube. And please be sure to like and subscribe to the podcast and write a review. We love hearing from you.